Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, finally talking about the upcoming season of Survivor, where we obviously just recently had the cast release for Survivor 45, and just like every other season, here we'll be doing my cast assessment for this season, where I'll be running through every member of the cast, talking about my thoughts on them along the way, and then eventually end up picking my winner pick for the season. Now, first, I'd like to start off with some general thoughts, and really, I feel like I've said a lot of them in my 45 cast reaction video I did a few months ago, and not really much has really changed from that. I feel like this is an interesting cast. It is a cast skewing on the younger side of things, though also just feels very much in line with recent New Era seasons, and through that, I think it can be a bit repetitive, but I still think there's enough interesting people here to still keep it a bit fresh. Again, the cast seems fine. I'm not fully in love with them. Again, I said this before, that I felt like the 43 and 44 cast stuck out to me a lot more from the offset and from their original trailers than the 45 cast does here, but not to any significant degree. I'm sure it'll be fine when we're watching the show. Again, my bigger issues are how the show is going to be formatted and presented. I'm sure I'll talk a lot about that in the review. So let's start running through the cast. I should mention that before making this video, the things that I have consumed are obviously the bios, along with the 1-minute clips from CBS themselves, these like intro packages that they release every time, along with the EW videos that came out as well, with the players talking about why they're gonna win and their thoughts on each other. So there was a decent amount of content I consumed before making this video. So let's start going through it. I will be running through this cast in alphabetical order of first name, starting it off with Austin. And this is a pretty good start to this cast here, in that I'm very high on Austin. Austin, while on paper, instantly comes off as someone in the Woo or the Ozzy archetype. I think he clearly knows the game. He is clearly a fan of the show. I think he clearly comes off as more intellectual than the likes of Woo or Ozzy, in a way that kind of reminds me more so of someone like a Malcolm. And because I am pretty high on Austin, I feel like he's someone that definitely has the potential to be a really solid all-around player, and mixing that with the fact that we did interestingly get this video on what the players are thinking about each other in the pregame, and Austin seems to have a lot of positive reception there, with a lot of people seeming to buy into him being more of this challenge beast than him having anything going on strategically, and I feel like that's probably a good sign for him. Now again, I think there's still the issue of endgame and him probably needing some comps towards the end, but overall, I'm very high on Austin, and I am keeping him as a winner contender. Next up, we're moving on to Brando, where there are two Brandons on this cast, but this one's going by Brando, and I'm largely conflicted on Brando. Now, I instantly do really like Brando. I feel like Brando and I have very similar backgrounds, and through that, I kind of resonate with him. But also knowing myself, I feel like he is probably going to be a high variance player. Now, he does seem to be pretty lively personality, kind of one that seems to be trying to play up this class clown, and through that could potentially do well socially, though I do feel like Brando's just kind of the type of guy that people are going to be kind of sketched out by, kind of assuming that he's more strategic than he lets on. And while we did literally just have Carson play a similar role on the season and not get found out until the end, I don't know if Brando will be able to replicate that success. And also, I mean, they saw the first half of 44, so Carson is probably going to be somewhat fresh in their minds, at least the first half of his game. So again, I feel worried about Brando, but I feel like he's one of these players that if he makes it deep into the game, I think he can do very well, but not someone I'm super confident in right now. Next up, moving on to Brandon Donlin, who is a massive fan of the show, almost definitely the biggest fan on this cast, being one that I know is a very prominent figure in the Survivor Online community. I know he's someone that had played Sequester online in the past, and through that, I feel very good about Brandon. I think he is obviously a fan that knows the show very well. He is used to playing these social strategy games online, and while obviously those aren't one for one, we did literally just see Carolyn come from the org community as well and do extremely well on 44. Mind you, I think the initial impression the others are going to have on them is extremely different, obviously, where Carolyn came off as this wacky, kooky character. Well, I think with Brandon, it's going to be pretty obvious. Again, he is a very strategic player. Though I will say also, it did seem like he had positive reception based on the videos, with a couple of people talking about wanting to work with him. And overall, I have a pretty good vibe about Brandon here. He's obviously by far one of the biggest fans of the show, and because I'm keeping as a potential winner pick. And next up, moving on to probably the biggest name of the bunch here, the first returning player on Survivor since Winners at War, we do have Bruce. And again, this is just kind of weird that of all people to be coming back right away, it's Bruce. But I mean, obviously, I'm excited for it. Obviously, he got screwed over the first time. Concussion right away. Never really got to truly play the game. And really, I do feel like from Survivor's perspective, they are looking at him as a newbie. I think they're putting him on here, treating him as a newbie, though obviously that's not going to fully be the case. I mean, obviously everyone knows who he is, and there was a lot of talk about Bruce being there in the videos, which can be a mixed bag. Obviously, there could be this reception of him being obviously just different due to the fact that he had already kind of played the game, and through that people want to target him. However, I feel like the opposite is really happening here. It does feel like a lot of people want to work with Bruce. To be honest, I would not be surprised if there was potentially some pre-gaming with Bruce, considering everyone knew Bruce was going to be on this season. But really, I feel like Bruce is in a surprisingly good spot on this season. Now, straight up, I'm not expecting it to be some sort of Redemption Island situation where Bruce just takes control of his tribe and runs the entire season to the very end. I'm not expecting that. However, I do think Bruce should be pretty well ingrained, at least on his initial tribe. And really, I don't see him going anywhere early on. Now, the question is, can he win the game? And that is where I'm a bit more questionable. Or even going back to 44, I was not super high on Bruce, where he seemed to be a bit scatterbrained and where he was thinking about the game, where there were points where he was talking about playing very cutthroat and making big moves, and then there's other points where he was talking about playing a loyal game. And again, I still don't fully know exactly what to think of Bruce as a player, but my guess is that I feel like, again, I think he's going to probably make the merge. I feel like he's going to be one of these people that becomes like a major mid-game threat that we've kind of seen in this new era of Survivor. These people who come into the merge with a lot of agency, but then just get taken out around the 7 to 8 spot in the game. And I feel like that's kind of the position I see Bruce being in here. Next up, moving on to D. And I'll say D is probably one of the people I had the hardest time reading here, where she seems to be a very affable person. She seems to be someone that will be very good socially, and through that, I don't really see her going home early unless it's a situation where she's just really bad strategically and she ends up being like a Justine sort of figure. But D seems like a pretty solid social player. I believe she's into CrossFit, so she should be good physically. And again, like really, I'd be surprised if someone like D doesn't make the merge. My biggest question mark with D though is strategy, where I don't really get the sense that she knows the game particularly well, especially in comparisons to many of the others that are on this season, where to me that is a minor worry. I mean, when looking at the recent winners of Survivor, I feel like a lot of them are people that had a very strong sense of the game and a lot of awareness with their game. And I feel like with D, I just don't know if she has that or not based on her interviews, and through that, just unsure of where exactly to assess her, and because that didn't move her on as a winner pick. Next up, moving on to Drew, and kind of Drew ends up being a very similar figure here to Brando for me. And the fact that they are the two youngest people on this cast. They're also two nerdier people, at least on the offset. Now, I do think there is a difference between the two, obviously, where I think Brando is probably going to play up the class clown aspect of it a bit more, while Drew is going to be leaning into more of the nerdier aspects of his personality. And again, I just don't know if it's going to work or not. I feel like he's a player that if he gets to the merge, I can see him making some big moves, but he's not really screaming out winner to me. I mean, if anything, he kind of screams out more like a Kane from 44. So that could be in a lot of strategy talks throughout a lot of the game, be in the know of what's going on for most of the game, and then just kind of get blindsided around the final 9. That's kind of the route I see for Drew if he does make it far. If he doesn't, then he's probably just won the first few boots and just doesn't really integrate with his tribe. I think it's a really mixed bag, and because of that, again, not super confident in him as a potential winner pick. Next up, moving on to Emily, and Emily's another one here that is a pretty high variance player in my mind, which straight up, I think a lot of this cast ends up being pretty high variance, which actually adds this interesting dynamic to this cast of it having so many high variance players that obviously some of these high variance players are going to make it far. But Emily is one that is probably the most high variance of the high variance players we've talked about so far, where, I mean, she compares herself to Cass, and I mean, in my mind, that's not a great person to really be comparing yourself to, where, and while Cass did make the merge both times and obviously makes it very far in Cagayan, and I feel like her connecting herself to Cass is more so from the Cagayan persona of Cass, I feel like that's bad, as I think Cass and Cagayan is probably one of the worst displays of jury management in Survivor history. And again, hopefully Emily's not that much like Cass. And really as a whole, I mean, I do like Emily. Emily's someone that I would like to do very well here. And truth be told, I didn't really get Cass vibes from her when I saw her interviews. While I did see like a bit of intensity that you would get from Cass, I kind of felt like it was a mix of like Cass and like Aubrey Bracco, to where I'm kind of hoping it's the latter. And again, I feel like she's a player that if she doesn't piss off her tribe early on and gets voted out because of that, I feel like she could make a deep run and potentially be a really strong player towards the end. But again, it is that question mark that also leaves her off my contender list. Next up, moving on to Hannah. And Hannah is a person that I think is pretty interesting here, and the fact that she's another one I do think is very high variance. However, my first instinct when watching her videos was that this is the first boot. This is the person that screamed out to me the most of, this is the person that I could see going home right away. However, the more I watched her interviews, the more actually I was impressed by her to a degree. It definitely feels like she has a decent amount of life experience. She is a fan of the show and does talk about being a mix of Aubrey and Kelly Wentworth, and I can kind of see that. Now, at the end of the day, I still don't feel great about her. I feel like there is still this like first boot potential from her, or if not just in general, early boot potential. Though I think something that could potentially save her from that is that this cast does seem to be pretty aware of the fact that women were being voted out early of the last few seasons, where we did see that mentioned in some of these videos, to where I would not be surprised if there's this initiative to try to not make that the case on this season. And through that, you would think it would further bond the women together, at least wanting to keep each other around for the short term, to where, again, I feel like if Hannah's able to survive those first few rounds, I feel like she should be in a pretty decent spot. But again, I do feel like it's still high variance because that didn't move her on as a winner pick. Next up, moving on to a person that I was expecting to be very high on after the preview, but then after doing all the research for this video, I'm kind of just okay with, and that person is Jake. And again, Jake was all over the preview in a position where I don't fully know why he did, where kind of similar to Ellie from 43, which, I mean, that didn't turn out to be a great winner pick there. His content didn't really feel like necessary to the 45 trailer, though he still was extremely present in it. And because of that, I was thinking this entire preseason that Jake was probably going to be my winner pick once the cast came out. And now that we have the cast, I really don't feel that way. I feel like Jake is fine. Like, really, I feel like very little of Jake really popped for me. Again, the EW videos really didn't do much for me. I read his bio and it felt kind of generic as well. I will say the one thing that did pop a little bit more is his CBS video, to where he talks about comparing himself to Chris Doherty and does seem to be a genuine fan of the show. Talks about having lost 80 pounds to go on Survivor. And again, that is definitely a lot of dedication there. And straight up, I'm still high on Jake, though I do feel like his interviews simply just didn't pop for me as much as I wanted them to. So while I think there's definitely still a major chance that he is the winner of this season, particularly based on how much content he got in the preview, which has been an indicator in recent years, I just feel like it wouldn't be genuine if I actually picked him in this situation based on how I didn't feel that great about his actual preseason content. So because of that, I didn't end up moving him on as a winner pick. Next up, moving on to J Maya, who is someone that I've been interested in ever since the cast came out. I ended up for some reason looking up her music and went through a bit of a rabbit hole there. But J Maya here is someone that I do really like. I think she comes off as a very likable person. Talked about how she made big risks in life and that's going to translate to Survivor. However, I actually don't feel that great about her on this season. While I do think she seems to be a very affable and intelligent person, a person that, again, I could see doing well, I feel like she is still very high variance, though in a bit of a different way than the likes of Emily or Hannah. For me, it's more so high variance the fact that, again, she isn't like as openly athletic as someone like Dee, and through that is still in the realm of someone that could be looked at as a physical liability. Though I think the bigger question mark for me is I do still have those question marks that I do have with Dee. I don't know how confident I am about J Maya's strategic ability, where through all of the videos I've seen, nothing really screamed out to me that she knew the show particularly well. And considering the fact that she is going by her stage name and keeps on talking about her singing career, it does kind of scream out to me that she's going on this for recognition for her brand more so than a love of the game, which again, I could be wrong, but I do get the sense here that J Maya is probably one of the least knowledgeable about the game on this cast, where that ended up being a pretty major red flag for me, to where, again, I really like J Maya here, but just not someone I'm feeling too confident in as a potential winner. Next up, moving on to someone that did surprise me in interviews, and that person is Julie. And Julie, like Hannah, coming into it, I was thinking, okay, this is a potential first boot. Like right away, she came off very similar to like Sandy Bergen from Survivor Tocantins, and just the energy that she brings. Though once listening to her more, I think she gets the game. I think she seems to know the game pretty well. She seems to know that, yeah, I'm going to be at a disadvantage at the very beginning, and seems to be already thinking of ways to counter that. Again, I think Julie came off pretty well in her interviews, where I'm actually feeling okay with her if she's able to survive those first few rounds. Where again, another high variance player. I do feel like she's going to have issues early on, but if she's able to overcome that, if she makes the merge, again, I feel like she could potentially become a pretty powerful player at that point, where I'm really, who's who's going after Julie until Endgame at that point. And if she's able to build up the respect along the way, again, she definitely would have a lot of win potential by the end. Though, to be fair, I think even that is still a major if. I do think there's a world where she kind of has this Carolyn side of her to where people just aren't going to inherently respect her. And while Carolyn obviously got more respect by the end of the game, it simply wasn't enough to win against the people she was at the end with. And I can kind of see a similar route for Julie, to where even if she gets to the end, she might just be against people that are respected slightly more than her. But still, I think Julie is actually someone that did surprise me in interviews. It's someone that I do feel somewhat decent about if she's able to make it far, but again, not as a potential winner pick here. Next up, moving on to maybe my favorite person on this cast, and that person is Caleb. And obviously I loved him right away from the 45 trailer, where he talks about him always loving villains. And he does very much seem like he's going to play like a villain on this season. He seems to be someone that is kind of openly saying that he's going to be a villain, which, again, I very much respect. I think that is something that Survivor's kind of been lacking recently, are these people that intentionally play up this villainous role. Yeah, I think it'll be fun to see Caleb on this season. And I also feel pretty good about him game-wise too. Now, I think there are some red flags here and there, but it seems like right off the bat, he is coming off as one of the most popular people on this cast, where we have this video, again, of the players talking about each other, and almost everyone is bringing up Caleb and talking about what a big personality he is. And again, I think that's kind of a mixed bag of a thing. I think it's good, obviously, in the fact that some people want to work with him, and that I would suspect that he's going to be pretty safe early on. However, I think it's this thing of it's probably going to turn around to him by the end game, to where he's probably going to be this massive target mid-merge. Though at the same time, I'll also say that he is a salesman, and he very much comes off as a salesman to me, to where I could also see that being a major red flag. And really, that's the main reason I'm not moving him on as a potential winner pick, is because I do feel like he comes off as a bit artificial in the way that he talks. Like, I could see people looking at him as a bit smarmy, to where I just feel like there's these red flags here, to where, again, I really like Caleb, and I could still see him doing very well. He seems to be someone that is potentially well faceted at all facets of the game, but there are these red flags that leave him off of my list of winner contenders. Next up, moving on to Katurah, who I also very much liked here in the preseason interviews. I think she's someone that does come off as, again, very affable, seems to know the game pretty well. And really, I feel like I feel the most confident about Katurah of the women we've talked about so far, to where I don't see her being an early boot. I feel like she's the type of person that should blend into her tribe pretty well, shouldn't really face any adversity early on in the game, especially in the modern era. But again, I think she's another one of these that I could see being a mid-merge threat. One of these that, like, towards the end of the game, they become targeted due to being someone that's relatively well respected, and kind of similar to someone like a Lauren from 44 or Carla from 43. I kind of see Katurah in that similar vibe, to where I think there probably is going to be that struggle to get to the very, very end. But she's someone that I do look at as a pretty big lock to at least make it to the merge. And from there, I think she could be a very powerful player, and due to that, I am keeping her as a potential winner pick. Next up, moving on to Kelly, who's another person here that I'm pretty high on. I feel like Kelly is someone that I really had no opinions on her at all coming into the preseason, where we saw very little of her in the preview. After reading her bio and listening to her interviews, again, I feel pretty good about her. She seems to be someone that I could see being well faceted at all facets of the game. I could see her being very good socially. She seems to know the game decently well, at least. Again, she is a recent fan, which is, I think, is probably the bigger question mark, though has been watching since COVID. But she seemed to have a pretty good head on her shoulders, talking about how her skills as a nurse will end up helping her in the game. She does compare herself to Cirie, which is always a good thing. And again, seems to be a decent enough physical asset to where I wouldn't expect her to be an early boot. Though, to be fair, I do feel less confident in that fact than with people like a Katurah or a D. But I think Kelly is someone that comes off very well faceted for this game, and someone that I didn't see any major red flags from her, to where I am keeping her as a potential winner pick. Next up, moving on to Kendra, where we're finally going back down to earth on my thoughts of these people, where Kendra was someone that I really didn't get a great vibe from. Not in terms of her personally, where she seems to be a really fun personality. So that, again, I think is very much in that Carolyn sort of mold of this like free spirit and this kooky character that I think will be really fun on the show. But I think a major difference between Kendra and Carolyn, for me at least, is that obviously Carolyn was a massive fan of the show and was someone that had played in orgs, obviously knew the game very well strategically. And with Kendra, I don't get that sense. To where I don't know how much Kendra really knows the game of Survivor. I don't think she knows it, especially to the level of Carolyn. And through that, I just wonder how much actual depth there is in terms of her strategic view of the game. But I could see her being this very affable social presence due to her quirkiness, which again, I think is something that would typically make you an early boot in early Survivor, though I think nowadays it's kind of come off as endearing. Even though I will say, I still feel like Kendra could be an early boot as well. I think she's definitely not fully safe from that. I think she is still, again, high variance player, someone that could go home early. But even if she makes it far, again, I just don't know if she'll garner the respect to win the game in a similar way that Carolyn did. So again, I'm largely a bit unsure on Kendra. I'm not feeling too great about her overall winning chances. Next up, moving on to Sabiyah, who is another one that, again, could be fun TV. Definitely feels like one of the more normal people on this cast. Someone that feels a little bit different from the typical casting choice we've seen in the modern era. But from a game perspective, I don't really get a great vibe from Sabiyah. Now, in terms of personality, she does kind of remind me of maybe a calmer version of Michaela. Like, not old school Michaela, where she was a bit brash, but I still feel like she has this intensity that Michaela had. Again, my issue with Sabiyah is more so, I don't really know what she's thinking strategically, where, I mean, she talked about her strategic thoughts on the game, which are pretty baseline thoughts of wanting to essentially build an onion alliance, but just the way that she talks about her strategy came off very rigid to me. It really doesn't feel like she's coming into this game with much fluidity to her game. Kind of the opposite of Kendra, where Kendra was talking about how she's not really coming in with any strategy. It feels like Sabiyah is pretty locked in with her strategy. Again, it just feels like she's not going to play this game in a very fluid way. I feel like she's going to be one of these players that finds her allies very early on, sticks with those allies, but doesn't really branch out beyond that. And I think she's one of these players that if the group that she makes right away doesn't become the group that actually controls her tribe, I feel like she very much could be in danger. I just feel like she doesn't seem to be very open to the level of fluidity that there typically is on Modern Survivor, and because of that, I do feel like she's someone I could see being left behind strategically and someone that I'm not super confident in on this season. Next up, moving on to Shawn Edwards, who is someone that coming into this, I knew absolutely nothing about. I had seen literally nothing from this person in the preview, and I'll be honest, I was kind of expecting him to be a pretty boring personality, but he was really anything but that. I thought his interview was actually like super fun. He has this really fun energy. To be honest, kind of too big of a personality. It's where he kind of reminded me of Monkey D. Luffy from the live action One Piece show, and how his interviews seem to be high energy all the time. Now, obviously, it's impossible to really play the game like that, and I don't expect him to be like that on the island. But again, I think he came off very affable in his interviews in a way that, again, was a bit surprising to me. Also, the fact that he is a massive fan of the show. I mean, he had a Survivor wedding and talks about how he's going to play like Todd Herzog, and again, I think there's a lot to like from Shawn I was not expecting coming into this season. However, again, I still feel like there's probably still a little bit of high variance. I do think there's still potential, Shawn being a relatively early boot. I could see a world where people don't really trust him early on and take him out because of that. I could see a world where he doesn't end up gelling with the rest of his tribe. And again, I think there is a bit of a question mark on how exactly he's going to be positioned in this game, but at least personality-wise, he definitely surprised me. I think there definitely is a lot more upside than what I was thinking coming into this. But again, it's the level of high variance that I feel like he's going to be that does keep him off my potential winner picks. And finally, the last person we're going to be talking about on this cast is Sifu, which him being named Sifu really came out of left field. Where in the preseason, we were just under the assumption he was going to be going by Nico. Again, very much feeling like this James situation that happened with 43. But again, I guess he's going by Sifu, which I'm assuming is him really playing up his martial arts background, where Sifu is essentially the Chinese equivalent of the term sensei. And again, I feel like this is probably just more so him playing up this character of him having this martial arts background, probably something he talked about a lot in casting and got him through casting. But as a player, I feel like he's another one of these people that I just don't really know much about him. I don't feel like I got that much of a vibe of how intensely he's going to play the game. Now, he did mention that the person he's going to play the most like is Tony. However, I didn't really get that vibe, but I wouldn't be that surprised if he does end up playing the game very aggressively. Really, more of the vibe I got from him was someone like Orion from Survivor 43, of a person that is this big physical asset for his tribe. and does try to make big moves at moments, but just doesn't end up being successful at it. And again, I can kind of see that with Sifu. I'm not really expecting him to be the greatest player on the board. Again, I don't really know how well he really knows the game, but I think he'll at least be an interesting player to see play here, where again, if there is this Tony upside, then obviously that'll be very interesting to watch, but I don't really have much faith in that actually being the way he ends up playing here. Anyway, that is the entire cast of Survivor 45. Now let's get around to making my winner pick, where the 4 people I end up still having as contenders are Austin, Brandon, Katurah, and Kelly. Now, the first one I'm going to be taking out here is actually surprisingly the person that I think I'm probably the second most confident in of these 4 in terms of how they're going to play the game, though there was a major red flag for me that nullifies them, and that person is Katurah. And the reason I'm not moving her on is because she was straight up invisible in the 45 preview, which again, this is very meta, obviously. But again, the previews have usually been an indicator of who becomes a major character on a season, and through that at least ends up containing the winner. And while last season I did go with Claire, who kind of gives me similar vibes to Katurah in the preseason, Claire was also almost invisible in the preview, and look how that turned out. So again, I feel like even though I feel pretty confident on Katurah, I decided to drop her here simply because, again, it didn't work out for me last season. So now we're down to 3, where the person I'm actually going to be cutting here is a bit of a surprise to me, where in the preseason I was assuming that this would be the second person on my board, second to Jake, and that person's Brandon. And again, I would love to see Brandon do very well. I would still expect him to have a pretty solid run on this season. And straight up, I mean, he did get the most content outside of Jake in the preview, which is obviously, again, a good sign for Brandon at least becoming a major character. But for me, I feel like that is it. I feel like he is going to be a major character / player on this season. I don't know if he's going to be the winner, though. I feel like someone like Brandon is someone that very rarely gets to the end and ends up winning. I feel like I could see Brandon being more so someone in the vein of like a Jesse or a Ricard, this like end game threat that gets sniped right before the end. I kind of see that more so for Brandon than a potential winner. So again, I didn't move him on. But with that, it leaves me with a top 2 of Austin and Kelly, which was not the top 2 I was expecting coming into this, where both of them are kind of in a similar vein. I think they're both pretty well-rounded players. Both people that I expect to make it pretty far into the season. Both people that, again, I think could do very well socially. I think both people that seem to know the game pretty well, and both people that seem to be physical enough to where getting through the merge is probably not going to be that much of an issue. And also, both of which were not that prominent in the preview, which is kind of a red flag in itself, but where, I mean, at least they were on it, unlike Katurah, but again, didn't really have anything of substance in it. But between these 2, I'm going to go with the person that I'm just the most confident in here, where I think they're both very similar. However, the person I am going to pick here is Austin. And again, Austin does give me kind of Malcolm vibes, and that's kind of the way I see him playing this game. Now, again, obviously with that comes issues at the end game, to where you are going to be targeted towards the end of the game, especially if they start to figure out that you're not this Wu or Ozzy like they were expecting. But with Austin, I do feel like I feel more confident in him powering his way to the end than someone like Kelly. Feel more confident in him potentially having idols towards the end game, or winning the last few immunity challenges, potentially winning the fire making challenge at 4. And with the way the end game is structured nowadays, if he's able to make that end game stretch, I do feel pretty good about his potential of potentially winning out there. So if he gets to the end, again, I assume he's the type that would win a jury vote, especially if he's able to articulate his game very well. Again, like, he just seems like a very solid all-around player, and one that seems to know the game pretty well, which is why I'm keeping him as my winner pick here. But there we go. I mean, that is my cast assessment for Survivor 45. Now, obviously, moving forward, I'll be doing similar coverage for Survivor 45 that I've done for previous seasons. I'll be doing a mid-season power ranking around time to merge, followed by a really massive review at the end of the season, talking about all my thoughts on it, along with a player ranking following that. Now, if you want to follow my thoughts on the season as the season is going on, you can follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/TheMarine where I'll be streaming live at 11 p.m. every Wednesday after every episode. And beyond this, obviously, just expect more of the same content on this channel. Now, again, there's so much stuff going on nowadays. We have Big Brother 25 going on, where obviously I will be doing my mid-season power ranking of that pretty soon, along with the review and player ranking of that at the end of the season as well. We have The Amazing Race starting alongside Survivor. We have Challenge USA, A&W, all of which I'll be doing reviews of as well. Obviously, I have a whole bunch of other reality shows like Claim to Fame that just ended, a whole bunch of Traitor seasons, International Amazing Race seasons. A lot is going on right now, where if you want to hear me talk about those things, you can, again, follow me on Twitch. But in general, just again, expect more of the same from the channel moving forward. But for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.